The algorithm of information. What is the algorithm of information? Well, let us understand things. We have evidence that the universe is expanding, that there is no doubt about that in the scientific community. That means you can go backwards in time, as the world expands, and you'll get to a point where the universe began. And people say this was perhaps 13.9 billion years ago, perhaps 14 billion years ago, according to our understanding of time. So at this point, imagine at the beginning of the universe. There's no universe. We've gone back 13.9 billion years or 14 billion years or whatever the maths or whatever we find out in the future. But as it's expanding, we've got to go back to a point where the universe is like this. So imagine the beginning of the universe. Imagine. Some reaction must have instigated it all. It's not magic. Some reaction must have instigated it all. And there are only two explanations. The first explanation was that God was, or some creator, or some creationists were in the mood 13.9 billion years ago to say, let there be light or whatever, and we are here now. And then there's the second explanation is that the background conditions were just right for us to have an event that would create mass, that would create something that would turn out to be mass. The conditions were just right, at that moment. That means the conditions were not right for countless trillion billion years before. But at that moment, 13.9 billion years ago, the conditions, the underlying conditions were just right. So if those conditions are just right, we get creation, we get a big bang, Now, understand, if the conditions are right, it's either God or the conditions were right. If the conditions were right, it is governed by an algorithm. There is something that instigated it, that if something this, then we get this. If not, then we do not get a big bang. And for us, it was a yes. Those conditions were met, and we got a big bang. You understand? If either God or the conditions were right. If the conditions were right, that is, an algorithm will determine these are the conditions are right. A set of rules will determine the conditions are right. And once we get those right conditions, what it says, if the Big Bang happens, then you get all this mass being created, all this stuff being created, Scientists speculate that it was it was so hot, at the beginning, that everything was mishmash, there were no electrons, there were no protons, there were no particles as we know it. But it was all together in this soupy mixture. If the Big Bang occurs, you get the soupy mixture. If you get this soupy mixture, it will cool down as it expands. So you have a chain of rules happening. It will cool down as it expands, and when it expands, it can then, particles can be formed. This is a short story, you understand. As it's expanding and cooling, then you start getting stuff like gluons, quarks. As it's cooling down, electrons start appearing, neutrinos. And then it says, if these things form, then you can get hadrons. You start getting protons, and neutrons, and the electron. If these conditions, and then it says, then it continues. If an electron comes close to a hadron, to a proton, you're going to get hydrogen. and so on and so on. If a star explodes, you're going to get metals and carbons. You understand? You get this under these conditions. If and only if. If the star doesn't have enough mass, it will not explode. If the star does not have the right conditions, it will not explode. If it does have the right conditions, it will explode. You understand? That's how we get all this matter, all these heavy things. Besides hydrogen and helium, we start getting heavy stuff. These heavy elements. If and only if. You understand? It's an algorithm. It's all an algorithm. Everything, every single physics equation or chemistry equation or biology equation all falls into an algorithm. It's governed by the same algorithm. It gets more complex, but it's the same one that started off the Big Bang because it's one thing. You understand? Every single law explains a relationship, and every relationship is part of that algorithm. I hope this is clear. I'm as simple as it is. There is no other explanation except God created it. It doesn't matter who is telling you. It doesn't matter how famous they are. If they're saying, no, this thing didn't happen like that, and they cannot offer another explanation unless it's God. So it is either an algorithm or God. And as things go by, as it gets more complex, if these conditions are met, you get life. You understand? And then a whole sort of, the program gets more and more complex. But you can trace my behavior, your behavior. It's all linked to the same algorithm that said if the conditions are right, we will get a Big Bang. It's that simple, It's that simple. It's just like that. It's just an algorithm. From here, conditions are right, get a Big Bang. Conditions are not right, you do not get a Big Bang. Then you get a Big Bang. This happens this way. So, in fact, this also defends the idea of many universes, It's something which but because depending on the conditions, this amount of mass is determined by the algorithm. The conditions could have been greater so that more mass is created. You understand? So that's all it is. It's an algorithm. So all our laws, and then it comes down to me. If I feel okay, I'll make a video. If I don't feel okay, I will not make a video. It's all determined by an algorithm. That is the algorithm of information. The algorithm that determines how the stars behave, how the earth behaves, how you behave, how I behave, how countries behave, how nations behave, how zebras behave, how comets behave, how light, Einstein's bending of light around stars. It's all part of the algorithm. Every law is if this, if that. If light is like this, then it will bend around a star. Gravity will bend it, even though it has no rest mass as such. I hope you understand. It's not a difficult concept to understand. It's just politically difficult. Science is very politically heavy. It depends on who's bringing out the science. As soon as Lee Smolin steals this and says it, it's 100% correct. It's politics. Any other explanations are the God of the algorithm. All else is lies.